All you girls who rejected me and looked down upon me and, treated me like scum while you gave yourselves to other men. And all of you men for living a better life than me, all of you sexually active men, I hate you. I hate all of you. And I can't wait to give you exactly what you deserve. Utter annihilation.
Michael Halpin, thanks so much for coming on to talk beliefs all the way from Nova Scotia, Canada. You are an assistant professor in sociology and social anthropology at Dalhousie University, Canada, and are currently studying the experiences of socially isolated men. You've published papers on involuntary celibates, or incels, a growing and occasionally deadly phenomenon that we are going to be discussing in depth today. So, how have you been doing, Mike? It's getting colder over here in England, and I can only imagine what winters are like in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, it's actually, I would say, unseasonably warm right now. We've had a couple days of like 15, 18, 20 degrees. Saw someone wearing shorts yesterday. It is raining pretty hard right now, though.
Well, on this show, we usually talk about cults, but we also focus sometimes on other types of unusual beliefs. A topic I've wanted to tackle for a very long time is the incel phenomenon. But before we dig deep into the world of the incels, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Mike, what interests and fascinations have brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, it's a good question. In my career, I've primarily been what we'd refer to as a medical sociologist, so interested in health and medicine, the experience of illness. I did a lot of my research on something called Huntington's disease, which is a fairly rare genetic condition. I was getting my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison during the 2016 presidential election campaign. And like a lot of people, I was really caught off guard by the rise and appeal of Donald Trump. And I remember watching the election happen and just being totally shocked about how wrong my estimate of where the country was politically, how wrong that was. From there, basically like the day after, I got interested in these online communities that are a little bit more obscure, a little bit more right-wing, a little bit more controversial. Started out looking at 4chan and the boards there, mostly to just get a sense of what was going on in the world that I wasn't observing. From there, I became interested in incels and incel discussion boards. When I took a position at Dalhousie, I started collaborating with somebody who was in the Department of Computer Science. And together we really built up like a research program looking at incels, what incels are saying, some of the things that they talk about doing. Yeah. And we've kind of taken it from there.
Well, the best place to begin is to define exactly what is meant by an incel. So for anyone who isn't familiar with this term, what is meant by an incel?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to that question. So strictly speaking, an incel is someone who identifies as involuntarily celibate. So that's someone who wants to have a romantic or a sexual relationship that can't have one. So that could be a lot of people. There's a lot of people out there who wish they could engage in sexual activity and can't. The term incel has taken on, different meanings and permutations of meanings, particularly over like the last couple years and last decade in particular. So the term was originally coined by a woman who lived in Canada on her blog. So she created a blog for people who were the term would have been like love shy, people who, they felt like they were romantically rejected, or they couldn't get into relationships for one reason or the other. Maybe they didn't desire to be in a relationship. It was a pretty like open kind of community. So she's the one who originally coined the term. Her board became, from her perspective, like a little bit more toxic. The conversations became more negative and more hostile. A lot of young men joining the board and having kind of really negative opinions of women in particular. So she decided to close her site. There's also conversations popping up for incels communities on 4chan and Reddit, which are two very popular websites. Those ones are even more leaning towards the kind of, what some people might call like toxic discourse, a lot of hostility, a lot of misogyny. And from there, what we think of an incel in many ways kind of branches off in two different ways. You have this very descriptive way of talking about it, which is, people who want to have a sexual or romantic relationship and can't have one. Then you have the more ideological definition, which would be what we really think of when we think of the word incel for the most part, for people who are watching like the popular media, popular press, is men who were angry and aggrieved and misogynistic and upset that they cannot pursue a sexual or romantic relationship with women. This group, the kind of more ideological one, overwhelmingly heterosexual men. Majority of them in the English-speaking world are white men, but it doesn't mean that there isn't separation between the two communities. So there are people out there who would say like, I would like to have a romantic and sexual relationship, but I don't subscribe to this whole ideology that you see online. But by and large, it's the people that are running the incel message boards that I think really set the tone for what we think of what an incel is.
Mike, you and your colleagues have analyzed tens of thousands of comments on a popular incel forum site to better understand this community. So take us through what we might find on this site and ones like it. What do they talk about?
Yeah, well, they talk about a lot of things. If you just dropped into the main kind of discussion board for incels today, the first thing that's going to kind of capture you is the kind of really aggressive and caustic misogyny. I have a lot of students who are interested in looking at incels. I load up the site the first time they come in my office, show them just what happens to be on the top of the site right now, and ask them if they're really interested in diving into a community like that. The conversations are overwhelmingly geared towards negative discussions of women in what we found. So the misogyny, like really aggressive misogyny, characterizes both particular threads. So it's really representative, very well represented in individual threads, and also users' post histories. So you could pick a random user from the site that posts on the site, and you will find misogynistic content in their user post history. So it's something that is broadly engaged in on the website. By misogynistic, I don't mean things that probably a lot of your viewers are thinking. Things that are probably a little bit more shocking, I would say. They have a whole glossary of negative terms to refer to women with. The top term, the most frequently used term that they use is referring to women as foids, which is a way of saying like female android. And so it's a way of characterizing women as like these unfeeling, calculating machines. They can't have any emotions because they're rejecting incels. So situating women is kind of like deviant in terms of like what women should be doing emotionally towards men. The other really common term, and it's like very offensive for your listeners who are listening, is or watching, is roasty, and it's also very ubiquitous, and it's an incel term for the idea that women who have a lot of sexual partners, so not just sex but sexual partners, develop elongated labia. And so they use terms like this to refer to women very, 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 very frequently, almost ubiquitously. They use negative terms for women almost more than they use the term like woman in their conversations. There's also a lot of stalking and harassment of women that you observe on the site, posting pictures of women who they feel have wronged somebody, sharing personal information about women, where they work, where they live, pictures of their houses, posting social media for women that they think have wronged or aggrieved men in some way, almost always accompanied by really aggressive misogynistic language, threats of violence, or kind of pleas that someone would commit violence against this person.
It's weird. It seems like an alternative universe that exists in their head, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's what a psychologist would call like a cognitive distortion. I think that there is like a really distorted sense of how the world works and how women think and how women experience the world. I think one of the things that you get quite readily out of reading some of their discussions is that it feels like many of them, you would almost swear that many of them have never really talked to a woman at any point in their life. The idea of like a woman being in the world seems really foreign to them.
And is there a kind of a hierarchy that you see within the Incel online community?
Yeah, they use a ranking system for people who participate on the board that we view, which it starts off in kind of militaristic terms like private, sergeant, general. And then it switches to like kind of more Dungeons and Dragons-y type language, wizard, transcendental. Part of that language comes from this idea meme on 4chan that men who were virgins for a long period of time develop like wizard powers. And so it gets into that type of, I guess like almost like a masculine version of astrology type thing. And there is a real big difference between people who are really avid posters on these sites and people who are more casual participants. There's people that we have documented in our data set who are spending like thousands of hours on these discussion boards, making thousands of posts. When we look at them in terms of what they're saying about women, they're using like they have like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 posts that say really hostile, negative things about women, like all women are the C word, or all women are roasties, or all women are foids, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some people who are really, really plugged into that community and are spending a massive amount of time participating in it.
Yeah, it almost seems to me like in some way you can have sympathy for them because at least they're embracing what they see as their shortcomings, although they take it too far.
Yeah, the question of sympathy for incels, I think, is like a very difficult one, and it's something that I have like a conflicted relationship with myself. I'd say at the time of this specific interview, I don't feel a ton of like personal sympathy for them. As a social scientist or a professor, I feel some sympathy for the predicament that they find themselves in. There are things that incels say that are accurate. So one of the things that they're really concerned about is lookism, the idea that we stratify society based on physical attractiveness, physical appearance. Life is easier for people who are attractive. Life is harder for people who are unattractive. There's lots of evidence for that in psychology and sociology. It's a pretty well demonstrated, system of bias that we have. And some of these people are saying, in the context of like Tinder and Instagram, like how visual we are, the way that we do dating now, it's really hard if you're average or below average attractiveness or short as a guy, to even get past the introduction stage of a relationship. And I definitely have sympathy for that. A lot of them are as critical as they are of women, and they're critical of women to an astronomical degree. Many of them are also very critical of their own bodies and themselves. They complain about their wrists being too small, their noses being too big, their eyebrow, like this part of your eyebrow being too pronounced, and you need to shave that down. They're very critical of their height, their jawline. They'll do all sorts of, they're interested in many cosmetic surgeries to change their appearance.
But they don't go out to try to get a girlfriend.
Yeah,
so why do they do it?
Yeah, well, so this is where it comes down with like the kind of black pill logic. So in the incel community, in online male communities, there's something called the red pill, which is broadly characteristic of a lot of spaces, not just incels. And the red pill is the acceptance that there's a war against men and boys. Feminism has a bad impact on society, particularly for men. Divorce laws, labor laws, many other social policies are harmful for men, and you need to accept that that's part of society before you can start dealing with it and maybe protect yourself and protect kids. Incels go a step farther than that with something called the black pill. And the black pill is defined differently in different settings, but it basically is the acceptance of a hopelessness of their romantic situation, so that they're going to be forever alone. They'll never have a partner, and that is either the fault of women and their sexual marketplace strategies, or it's the fault of lookism. But the big takeaway is to be black-pilled is to like kind of give up hope. So you have some incels that are black-pilled, and they're just like, it's over for me. It's the only way out of this maybe is suicide, or just accepting that I'm always going to be alone. And there's other incels who, people would identify them as not being fully black-pilled, and that they think that changing their physical appearances would be a way for them to get a girlfriend. So it's a kind of alternation between like how fatalistic they are in the community. And when some of them are thinking of changing their appearance, they're thinking of changing their appearance like really, really radically, like leg lengthening surgeries that take months and they're super painful. Or this thing called mewing, which is pressing your tongue against the roof of your mouth to change the shape of your jaw. And there's a video that was shared on one of their sites where a young man was showing how he did this in his sleep by sleeping in a cold room with a backpack on so he wouldn't roll over, and on an inclined bed. And it's all to force his tongue into a certain position in his mouth to change the shape of his jaw, which he thinks will make him look, more attractive. And so those are also part of the discussions that they have. And I think it's a few people that have looked at those discussions, and I think few people that see them. Your mind goes really quickly to the idea of body dysmorphia. Are these people, do they have an accurate perception of their body or not? And do they see themselves as more repulsive and more ugly than perhaps they actually are?
Mike, what would you say are the behavioral attributes of these individuals? What do they like doing, and how do they speak to one another? Behaviorally,
to speak social scientifically, we have a little slice of their life, which is their online life. So, there's a question of how they look online versus how they look online. Is their online presentation different from their offline presentation? Their online presentation, there's a lot more diversity in the incel community than I think me and my colleagues were expecting. There's a lot more men of color in that community than we were expecting. There's people from all sorts of socioeconomic backgrounds. There's people who are pursuing very prestigious degrees in very prestigious universities. There's conversations about how white privilege might impact the dating market. There's conversations about racism. And then there's also people who are very avowed white nationalists and very avowed racists who are talking on these forums. They can be supportive of each other in some ways. We've seen conversations where very young men, like 16, 17, are talking about being incels, and older men are actually encouraging them, being like, you don't need to be black-pilled, you don't need to give up, you're still really young. There's no reason for you to join this community. We've seen them give each other kind of advice and support, with the idea being like, there's no hope for me, it is over for me, but maybe you have like a chance of getting out of this community if you do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes that advice is reasonable, and sometimes is completely out of touch with reality. Like, people suggesting that biting a woman on the neck during a first date is like a good move to show that you're like an alpha male and dominant, and women like that. And then there's a lot of conversation that basically encourages other users to harm themselves or commit suicide or to give up on themselves. So part of the community being really invested in this black pill logic is black pilling other people. So it's if you see a conversation where someone is talking about changing their physical appearance, like growing a beard or getting some cosmetic surgery on their face to become more appealing, you'll see other users being like, why are you going to do that? That's going to do nothing. It's not about looks. It's not just about like looks that you can solve through surgery. It's like it's like in your DNA. There's no hope for you. You will always be repulsive. No woman will find you attractive at all. And when people talk about harming themselves, there will be people who express concern and encourage them to not think about doing that or discourage them from doing it. And there's always a portion of the community that is happy to jump on and encourage someone to commit acts of self-harm. So behaviorally, they run a very wide gamut, much larger than I think people would appreciate from like a very superficial understanding of them. One of the things that they almost always ubiquitously they're always doing, they're very engaged in, is negative conversations about women. And it's one of the things that we've discussed that really unites the community is their antipathy towards women, their misogyny, their hostility towards women. I've had email exchanges with incels who've read my work who've, argued that they're not misogynistic, while making really misogynistic arguments, because it's almost like they're so enmeshed in this idea of women having these certain preferences, or women just being really animalistic with their sexuality and only caring about like the very attractive 10 out of 10 guys and nothing else. No woman will ever be faithful.
Because it couldn't possibly be about them, could it? It
No.
has to be the women's fault.
Yeah, and so it's definitely not about them. And so this is where this is the thing that unites like a lot of their ideology is it's not about them. So one of the other things that really binds them together as a group is this idea that it's not about your personality and it's not about confidence. So you're not alone because of some changeable trait about your personality or individual characteristics. It's that women find you ugly, you are an ugly person, you cannot change. The world has to change, which I think we can talk about a little bit later. The world has to change, but it's impossible for me to change because the criteria by which I'm being judged are unchangeable. One of the ways that they try to prove that personality doesn't matter is by doing these things that they call Chad fishing experiments. And what Chad fishing is, it's like a riff on catfishing, but it involves going onto Tinder and creating a fake profile. They'll use pictures from a very attractive man, like anyone would agree, very attractive man, like 6'3", like, six-pack abs, like Brad Pitt in the 90s type of attractive.
And that's a Chad.
That's a Chad.
Sort of chiseled name.
Yeah, with apologies to present-day Brad Pitt. But that's a Chad. That's like the alpha male, the person who is like, they believe can have a sexual relationship with any woman that they're interested in. They believe that they have multiple sexual relationships at the same time. And it's really for them, because they care about looks, it's really like an appearance-based thing. So it doesn't have to be, Chad doesn't have to be like an investment banker on Wall Street. Chad can be like just a guy in your small town who's just really attractive. And they describe, they will, as much as they talk about women, they really do describe and fixate on what makes Chads attractive as well. It's like the jawline, the nose, the voice, the body language. They get in a lot of details, like the ratio between the upper lip and the distance to the chin. So in ways, how the eyes are slanted, all these ways that you wouldn't think that men would be talking about the attractiveness of other men's bodies. They go in a lot of detail about these Chads, and they think that's the reason why these men have all the sexual success in the world, and why, on the flip side, incels are struggling. So with these Chad fishing experiments, they'll take a picture of a guy like this, and they will upload it on Tinder, but they'll include a bunch of negative information about them as well. So like maybe like a prior arrest, interest in like Nazi ideology, or stated interest in sexual interest in like minors, like 16, 17-year-olds, things like that. Then they go on Tinder with this profile, and then they swipe right on a bunch of women. For people that don't have Tinder, that would be like indicating that you're interested in a match with somebody. And when women match back with this fake profile, they'll have conversations with them that reveal more offensive traits, like all I'm interested in is having sex with you. Let's have sex right now. What's your phone number? By the way, like I do X, Y, and Z that's like really rude or very aggressive. And so they'll pick out some women who respond to this positively, that appear to be interested in having like a match or a relationship or a meeting with this guy. And they'll use that as evidence that it can't be about personality. It has to be about looks. Because if it's about personality, this really attractive guy who's like has sexual interest in minors, is super selfish and self-interested and dislikes women, and is like a enthusiastic supporter of Adolf Hitler, he wouldn't be getting matches online. So those are the types of things that they use to distance themselves from the idea that they might have to change their personality. They might have to be more confident. I bring up confidence because a lot of them don't actually approach women in public. including Elliot Rodgers, very famously, they have the idea that people should come to them instead because that's what happens with Chad. So they look at these Chads, which are like the alpha males for them, and they say, is this idea that if he doesn't have to do any of these things, then neither should I. If he can do all this stuff, all this negative stuff, and still have relationships, then it's proof that lookism is the thing that's creating incels and creating this community. There's no way for me to change my personality or become more charismatic or get a talent or whatever. It is just lookism. And then that leads to the acceptance of the black pill, that it is over. Your fate has really been decided. There's nothing that you can do or change about it.
It really does seem to be avoiding the issue of maybe I need changing, my personality needs changing. Oh no, I'm not going to deal with that. The universe needs changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's 100%, I would say, like a very convenient framing of the situation. You look at what some of the people who are posting on there, some of their opinions or attitudes towards women, and it's like, that absolutely does have to change, you know? Like, there may be favoritism towards people who are very attractive, and maybe people who are very attractive can get away with some things that other people cannot. But, you know, a small portion of the planet is actually very attractive. The way that they talk and think about women is absolutely going to be part of their problem. They have attitudes and ideas about women that seem like they must be like 300, 400, 500 years old sometimes. And then they really do situate women as either objects or animals. Is primary way that they talk about them is either just being sexual objects or just mindless animals that just gravitate towards Chads. So they use that as a way to excuse themselves out of a lot of their misogynistic beliefs, a lot of the things that they say and believe about women, and like the consequences of that, and also how women might feel or react to those types of statements and beliefs.
If I can't have you, girls, I will destroy you. You denied me a happy life, and in turn, I will deny all of you life. It's only fair.
Well, we can't talk about this subject without going into the horrific attacks made by self-proclaimed incels upon young women, most prominently the 2014 shootings in California by Elliot Rodger, who is now seen as a kind of saint by some incels. So take us through those incidents and how those attacks affected incels in general.
Yeah, so in many ways, I think people's first introduction with incels in terms of, popular culture or mass media was after Elliot Rodgers. So Elliot Rodgers was a young man who lived in California, had a pretty affluent, privileged background, recorded a lot of videos that were basically him on his own, expressing his frustrations with being single and why women didn't want to be around him. He had a lot of problems understanding why he was alone. For people who watch the videos, one of the first things that you get is that he definitely is like a very lonely and kind of sad person on one hand. On the other hand, he's a exceptionally narcissistic person and has, again, like really derogatory views about women. So it was the idea that, I have a nice car, I have expensive sunglasses, like I'm in shape. Like why are women not interested in me? That's all women care about. They just care about like money and resources. So a little bit different from like the kind of modern day discussion on incel message boards. And Rodgers wrote a manifesto, a pretty lengthy one, and then murdered several people, including his roommates, and ends up dying in the attack that he committed. Online, after that, a lot of incels have positive evaluations of what Elliot Rodgers did, they saw it as like a way of getting back at the people that had hurt them, including the Chads, but also what they refer to as Stacys, which are like the very attractive women who they often feel ignored by. So this idea that there's like an emerging incel revolution, that people were gonna, like a beta uprising, that men who felt like excluded weren't gonna take it anymore and they're gonna react with violence. A lot of people referred to Elliot Rodgers as the supreme gentleman, kind of riffing on some of his own narcissistic language about himself.
Yeah, he calls himself that, doesn't he? And
he does, yeah. And he's like, I'm such a gentleman. I'm like so glorious. I like a psychologist or a psychiatrist would have a field day watching those videos, because it is just really the epitome of narcissism.
It almost looks like a joke when you see him in his car and he's running his hand through his hair. And I think, is he serious? But I think he was.
Yeah, I think he was serious. And there's, if you watch it detached from what he did, it's really sad. Like you see someone who's quite obviously, I think, struggling with their mental health, and also someone who's profoundly isolated. But you can't look at them in isolation, because he also murdered a lot of people, and including his roommates, that even incels are like, why did he murder those guys? Yeah. There was, in many ways they were living similar lives to him. So in some ways he's become like beatified in the incel community, and there's a few ways that they react to him. So one way is, there definitely is like an ironic beatification of Elliot Rodgers. So people are like, call him Saint Elliot, but it's kind of tongue in cheek, and they don't really mean it.
I don't know why the problem is girls, and I don't know why none of them give me a chance. I don't know why the problem is girls, and I don't know why you girls never give me a chance.
There are people that see Elliot Rodgers as very harmful for the incel community, that he's kind of like the archetype incel, and he committed this act of mass violence, and he's very obviously narcissistic. He also has a lot of privilege that some incels feel that they don't have. So there's some criticism of him. Some of that criticism branches off into not him killing people, but that he killed the wrong people, that he should have killed more Stacys, more Chads, and that his small, relatively small or low body count is kind of humiliating for the incel community. And then there's a group of people who legitimately do refer to him as Saint Elliot. They have images that put him in kind of like Roman Catholic style paintings and glassworks, and they refer to him in a really positive way. And since his killing, going ER, so capital E, capital R, has become a euphemism in the incel discourse for committing mass murders or acts of violence. So you may not be savvy to it just jumping into an incel website, but you will see references to going ER, or just someone capitalizing the letters ER in a post. And what they're referring to is committing murders, committing homicides, multiple homicides. And when they talk about things like a lot of incels will share stories of their humiliation. So being humiliated by a Chad or a Stacy, and how that made them feel. And it just proves that lookism is this thing. And it's fuel for the black pill, it's rage fuel, or it's suicide fuel. And in the responses, someone shares a story. One of the stories that we read was a guy, and it is like a very uncomfortable story. The guy is in a dorm room. He has an attractive dorm mate. His Chad dorm mate comes back with a Stacy, and the incel feels like they're gonna have sex. They have their bedrooms in the same room, as happens in the United States in dormitories. And he's like, I'm gonna go leave, I'll come back. They promise him that they're not gonna have sex, and then he's like, okay. And then he's lying down in his bed. When they think that he's asleep, they start having sex, and he overhears them having sex. After they're done having sex, he hears them criticizing him and kind of making some jokes at his expense. At that point, he gets up out of bed. They have like a brief interaction, and then he goes back to bed. He shares a story on the discussion board. There's many people in the discussion board, multiple people, who are encouraging him, you should have killed those people. You should have gone ER. You should have gone Elliot Rodgers. You should have killed both of them and kept on killing people. they've humiliated you, they've taken away your dignity. If you're ever going to come back to this community again, you need to go kill those people. So in that sense, Elliot Rodgers is kind of like a touchstone for committing acts of violence, and he's a model for what acts of violence would look like in the incel community. That it's not just one or two, it's not an assault, it's a homicide. And it's not one or two homicides, it's like, you killed one or two people, you should just keep on killing people after you've done that. Their orientation to violence, there's they absolutely are talking about committing acts of violence fairly frequently, and acts of mass casualty violence. So that's absolutely part of the community. How many people end up acting on those thoughts and encouragements or discussions is a harder question to answer. And a recent study done by some people in Australia suggests that there's about 50 murders presently that we can connect to incels.
Wow. And I know Alec Minassian, who I think is, dare I say it, a fellow countryman. He was also, he was talking online with Elliot Rodgers and was directly influenced by him to go out and mow some people down, which he did. I mean, is this happen a lot? Do you think it's going to happen again?
Yeah, Minassian is an interesting case. He is Canadian, so it happens in countries outside of the United States, which we often associate with these kind of acts of mass violence. Minassian is an interesting case because he did really try to pin the motivation for his crimes on the incel ideology and the incel community, suggesting himself as a representative of that community. There was some skepticism in the actual judicial system, how much of it was him trying to represent an incel ideology and how much of it was actually just him trying to become kind of as famous as possible and as self-aggrandizing as possible. So there's a little debate about how Minassian might fit in all this, but if you look at the act that he committed, it has a lot of similarities to what Elliot Rodgers did in many ways. And of course, he is still claiming that he's doing it for those reasons.
And it was just random people, including elderly ladies. I mean, this is not exactly the so-called Stacys, is it?
The people who they seem to be angry about, and then the people who they end up murdering, there is like a gap there. So maybe the one exception would be the mass shootings that happened in Atlanta in the United States. But primarily, they have all this anger towards Chads and Stacys, and when they commit these mass murders, there's a lot of people of a lot of different backgrounds who they end up murdering. One of the kind of incel critiques of Elliot Rodgers is that the suspicion that his roommates, or at least one of his roommates, was also an incel, and that he stabbed them like multiple times, I believe, and that so he's murdering someone who's in the community, and that's one of the things that people kind of criticize him for. But yeah, as much as they talk about targeted violence against primarily women and then somewhat Chads, the acts of violence end up being a lot less guided by their ideology and more just, they're also very angry at society in general. And I think you see that in the types of killings that they commit, like Minassian just going down like a busy street in Toronto and not caring at all who he's hitting. In terms of whether these things will happen more in the future, I'm of the opinion that I absolutely think it's going to be more common in the future. I think since Elliot Rodgers, there have been several attacks linked, as skeptical as you want to be about Minassian, that have been linked to this ideology. And, the recent one in the United Kingdom being one example. So I absolutely believe that there's going to be more people in these communities that commit these acts of violence, and they really are talking about approaching the world violently a lot of the time. So it's a lot of people are talking about killing themselves, and a lot of people are talking about killing others, and it's very easy to find discussions of that on an incel forum. So unfortunately, I absolutely think that we'll see more acts that look like Minassian and look like Rodgers. The other thing to consider, we do talk about Elliot Rodgers, Alec Minassian, that type of violence, and it gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so. It's very important. I mentioned that I think that those types of incidents will happen again in the future, and it's obviously something that we have an interest in wanting to stop. Something that I think goes under the radar often with incels is their ideas about systemic or institutional violence, what we would say in the social sciences. One of the really commonly discussed solutions to the incel problem in incel communities is this idea of what they call state-sponsored girlfriends. So it's an idea that that the men being incels is going to eventually collapse society, or it'll be hazardous to society. We need to do something about it. How do we resolve the problem in their perspective? Well, they think that women should have their rights to work removed, their rights to decide who they get married removed, their ability to get divorced removed. Basically, every civil human right that women have, they should be removed. Women should be quite literally situated as property that are owned and controlled by men, and to be distributed amongst men. So the idea here is that there's either a government or some large social institution that distributes women as commodities amongst men, so that every man has every heterosexual man has a woman as a partner. And I mean, it sounds completely out of touch with reality and kind of like very like a strange combination of like Margaret Atwood and communism at the same time. Yeah. But it's something that they discuss as like a real serious solution to this problem. And it's one of the reasons that incels, a lot of incels support policies that penalize women, that harm women, whether it's, you know, the abortion discussion that's happening in Texas right now, or the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. They were big supporters of that. And one of the reasons that they're big supporters of that is because they're happy to see women lose their rights. And they think that if women have their rights restricted in the countries that they live in, that will be good for incels, because it restores men's status. And even if they're below Chad's, even if Chad has, you know, 10 wives and they have one, they're fine with that. What they want is to have a situation where women can't say no to them, and is even a government mandate that they have to be partnered.
God. That is astounding, because on one hand, you know, some of them will try to change their appearance, so presumably to make themselves more attractive and have sex and a relationship, but at the on the other side of the coin, they just want to treat them as property.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like we have this discussion in the academic literature and in popular press a lot of times about sexual assault, that it's not about sex, it's about power. And I think the same thing is really true with a lot of incels. It looks like a community that's about trying to have a relationship or trying to have sex. And I think that that's not true for many of them. For many of them, it's about having power over women, making women feel subordinated, making them feel marginalized. And a lot of them talk about getting more enjoyment out of degrading and denigrating women online than the idea of having sex with a woman.
Well, it's been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of incels, and I'm sure we could talk a lot longer about this subject. I will leave links to your research papers in the description below, and hopefully, Mike, we can have you back on the show in the very near future.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. It was a great opportunity to talk about an issue that I think a lot of us feel is very important in my research. More than happy to come back on, and maybe a member of the community themselves, an incel, will volunteer to have a conversation with you too.
I don't know why the problem is girls, and I don't know why you girls never give me a chance.